One of the things that we've realized over the last few years, and probably a lot longer, has been the need to get drugs to our patients quickly. Can you talk about where you are in revamping the accelerated approval process for drugs? What do you think is most important in the current process? And how do we think about monitoring different classes of agents for different diseases?
Wow, that's a three-part question. I'll try to remember all three parts as we go through it. So you use the word revamp, and I'd say it's not us revamping so much as Congress has inserted itself into revamping. But it's not with the basic fundamental of accelerated approval, which is the premise that if there's a serious life-threatening disease for which there's no effective treatment, it's sort of in the American DNA that people are willing to take more risks than if there's a disease for which there's already a treatment that's effective. And so the idea is that based on either intermediate clinical outcomes or biomarkers, in this case unvalidated biomarkers, if the FDA thinks that the data support that it's reasonably likely that the biomarker predicts a clinical benefit that outweighs the risks, then accelerated approval is enabled. The key to the revamping, so to speak, is I would say the performance of the industry in getting the follow-up studies done that were required. In other words, at that point, you said you have market access, but it's based on a standard of reasonably likely, not a standard of proven clinical benefit that outweighs risk. And so the next phase, while on the market, should be to get the studies done to prove that, in fact, the benefits do outweigh the risks. I would say the industry didn't measure up in that regard. Congress recognized it and said, we're going to give the FDA more authority to do several things, like require that the follow-up study is already enrolling before the approval is given, and more teeth about if the job's not getting done, withdrawing that product from the market. And we all know this gets really complicated and messy on an individual basis. Now, but those are the major changes. If I had to say one thing that would make it better, all of you academics out there that want to start biotech companies based on your favorite pathway and biomarker, make sure that you develop assays that will reliably measure the biomarker and that you constantly have in mind the fundamental that an association between a biomarker and outcome is not proof that the biomarker is in the causal pathway and therefore a reliable surrogate. And so really careful attention to those issues would, I think, do the most to help us out. It's terrible when at the FDA we get something that looks really good, but the studies are poorly done. And I would say the controversies that we mostly see are when the studies are inadequate to give us the information that we need. Now, Lindsey, you also said something about classes of drugs. What were you getting at there?
Well, are there different categories of drugs that require different type of monitoring? And one could imagine that with gene therapy, one could imagine that with anti-infectives. And so how does the agency prioritize how to monitor for success or failure, particularly if the initial assessment is through biomarkers?
Let's see, how many days do we have to discuss this? I think one of the really fundamental things about the FDA and about the statute, that the Food and Drug Law that supports the FDA, is that it calls for allowing products on the market, medical products on the market, particularly drugs and biologics, when the benefits outweigh the risks based on adequate and well-controlled clinical studies and the view of experts in the field. And so a critical thing about FDA is having our group of non-conflicted federal employees who are civil servants and can't have a conflict of interest, at least financially, as any part of their employment and being. And so every area is different, and we have a body of experts in every area. I know we'll get to advisory committees soon, but it's also very important when those decisions are made about what's different about gene therapy for rare disease and cardiovascular disease or infectious disease, that there's the development of a common view in the ecosystem about what the standard should be. So I think the answer is it is all different, and it's very dependent on expertise about the disease, the patient population, and I would just add input from the patients about what it's like to live with the disease.
And as you sort of hint at, there are different kinds of products. And think about with gene therapy, the N of one. You know, we were talking earlier about Maseratis, and we are able to develop very targeted therapies for very individual diseases. How does the agency, how do you view approval for those unique kind of targeted therapies? And in addition, how do you think about safety in the long term, where safety issues may be years down the road, and therefore it's very challenging to make that risk-benefit assessment?
Well, you just gave me a great entree into my recruitment pitch. Everyone involved recognized that this area of rare and ultra-rare genetic diseases is going to be one of the hottest areas of medicine in this next phase. And so in PDUFA 7, the user fee agreement, there's funding to hire 150 or so people. I think Peter Marks has already been here or will be here in the next day or so. And you know, Peter's in charge of the biologics area, and Patrizia Cavanossi on the drugs area. And Peter and Patrizia are going to be hiring a bunch of people because no one knows exactly what to do right now in these situations. So what I'd say is we need to aggregate information as we make decisions, and we'll learn from it. But we need really smart people working at the agency who can help us work through this. I also have to say that in cases that are not like bespoke individual gene therapies, it doesn't all have to be, you know, like a special concoction made up in everybody's individual kitchen. So we've got to, in areas where we can, we've got to make this a robust industry that's reliable and predictable in terms of what it's delivering. And that's another big part of what I think the task is going to be for the agency, is helping the industry go from having a bunch of chefs in each individual kitchen to having a product that a patient can rely on no matter where they happen to come into the system.
And if things are approved, you mentioned this, does the FDA now have the teeth to do post-approval follow-up to ensure that if you approve it based upon imperfect data, to really reassess if it behaves the way we hope it does in the community?
We have the teeth, but we don't have the system yet. And you know, we'll probably get into this also a little bit more in the 25 minutes that we have. But you tell me, Lindsey, you're at like one of the best academic medical centers in the world. We got 340 million people with electronic health records and all these smart people. The way I like to say it is, why do I have to call Israel to figure out what to do with the next dose of vaccine? And why do I have to ask the UK what works for COVID? Because they are using their EHRs and their health system to answer questions quickly. We seem to spend a lot of money and have a bunch of competing health systems that can't punch their way out of a paper bag right now when it comes to this. So we should be able to follow people that got gene therapy for a lifetime based on their electronic health records. So we're going to be working on that, and I have great hopes that the NIH and CMS and CDC are going to work together with a public-private partnership to make this possible. Otherwise, how are we going to follow these people? So we got the teeth, we need the system.
Tazeen?
Okay, so Dr. Califf, maybe to switch gears just a little bit, you just did mention CMS. So on that topic, you know, we've seen CMS potentially diverging from FDA in the sense that even if the agency does approve treatments, they are not necessarily recommending reimbursement. And so how do you think about that dynamic, and how could we potentially see more communication between your agency and CMS in order to have a more cohesive view about drugs once they're approved?
Well, I mean, let me start by, this is just my opinion, of course, but I'll just reject the diverging thing. We have different missions. FDA is safe and effective standard. And as I said, the statute says adequate and well-controlled clinical studies in the view of experts in the field. And the approval is based on studies for a particular indication in a particular population. That doesn't mean it works for everybody in whom a doctor wants to try it. And the FDA is specifically not supposed to deal with the practice of medicine, to interfere with the practice of medicine. Now, there's a gray zone there, we all know. But fundamentally, CMS is charged with the reasonable and necessary standard for the population that it covers. And that's a different standard. So I don't really see it as a divergence. I see it as different standards. CMS doesn't tell us what to decide for safe and effective, and we don't tell CMS what to decide for reasonable and necessary. But I think it's been a tragedy in this country that these worlds have been just almost entirely separate, and we are communicating a lot. And I think the way to think about it is, while we have different standards, it's like a relay race. We're working with the industry through several laps, and then we hand off the baton to the payers, and CMS is obviously the biggest payer, but it ought to be a handoff, not a dropping it in the dark and having the payer trying to figure out where it is and pick it up and make decisions. And that means, as we discuss things, we need to think more and more about how to design the right clinical trials so that baton handoff is smooth, and we're looking at the data that we all agree would be the most important data to make those critical decisions. So we are talking a lot, and I think we're making progress, but don't confuse that with we ought to have one opinion about everybody in the United States getting a particular treatment or not.
But I think
It's just my opinion again.
But I think that then speaks to designing the correct study for approval, but also that may be science-driven and not as generalizable. Once approved, demanding the correct studies to know how best to use it in the population. And is that an opportunity for the agency and CMS to work together to make sure we have the data to know how to treat our patients who could most benefit?
And yes, and that's a leading question. I fully accept it. My history is I started out as what you would call an outcomes researcher doing comparative effectiveness with a database. And then I saw there were a lot of questions you couldn't answer with that kind of methodology, and got very interested in randomized trials and evolved from there. But I was in this unusual field of cardiology where you did very large clinical trials right off the bat and built in cost effectiveness into the clinical trials. So our big trials, we would publish the result, and the cost effectiveness study would follow after it. And that was I felt a pretty clean way to deal with these issues. But as we discussed, if you're in something that gets an accelerated approval, by definition, you can't do that. So we have this spectrum, and we have this very expansive and longitudinal post-market phase where we got to get better at what we do. Because I'm sure you're aware, right now, our life expectancy in the U.S. is 5 years shorter than the average of other high-income countries. We're spending $4.3 trillion a year, so there has to be some way that we're not spending the money on getting the right interventions to the right people at the right time. And FDA approval is not designed to answer all those questions. But also remember that we have accountability for post-market safety. And so there is a place for us to work together. But I want to keep it clear, though, we're not talking about CMS deciding what FDA decides or vice versa. It's really, how do we design a system so those who develop the best products and the best interventions get paid, and that those therapies get to the people that need them. That's not happening so well right now.
Maybe going back to the point of accelerated approval. So, as we await potentially new guidance about the qualifications and what would need to be met, for companies that choose to, run these confirmatory studies with agreement from the FDA, do you think that there should be a time limit that's put into place by which a confirmatory study needs to have data read out?
I think there should be a view of the time limit, and there should be constant communication. I think one thing that a lot of people don't understand unless you've been in the business of medical product development is the amount of communication that normally occurs during product development. And I think in these post-market studies, it's the same thing. I mean, I'm a clinical trialist. I'm fully aware that you often run into problems that you didn't expect when you're trying to do a clinical trial. It's also the case that sometimes, I'm sure neither of you knows any companies that would do this, but sometimes you drag out the study as long as you can if you're unsure that you're going to get the result that you want. And so this takes judgment and interaction with the FDA. But the key is Congress is not giving us teeth. If things are not going the way they should, we can call the cards on it.
Okay, thanks for that. So when you started the talk about, recruiting smart people to work at the agency and the fact that FDA is made up of government employees who don't have conflicts of interest, but you did make some recent comments, and I wanted to follow up on that about, the coursework of medical students, that in certain cases, the drug companies themselves might be funding that coursework nowadays. That on the surface seems like a conflict of interest. And how do you think, people should be dealing with that? How should medical schools be addressing that?
Well, I'm going to try to be as careful as I can here, because I think this is a very complicated set of issues. And I would ask the question, why would there ever be a need for a pharmaceutical or a device company to fund coursework for medical students, or for that matter, for house staff or physicians who work in a health system? But I also feel compelled to point out the healthcare delivery industry is much, much, much larger than the medical products industry. And if you think there's not bias in health systems today in the United States in terms of what's taught and what things are allowed, I'm sorry. I experience the opposite. If you ask me about lobbying Congress, for example, I think the academic medical centers are pretty darn strong in lobbying for financial interests of the academic medical centers. So I don't fundamentally think that we should be having medical products companies paying for education of clinicians. On the other hand, I think our health systems are not doing the best job right now in a lot of these areas. So I don't like either situation. We've got to get better.
Okay. So maybe let's switch gears.
Let me just say another part of this that I do like to talk about is like sales reps. Why on earth do we have sales reps? We shouldn't need them. But when you go around and ask, practicing docs, do they have time to actually learn about how to use the new therapies that come out? Are they getting taught well about the risks and benefits independently of the companies? I think the answer is no. And so there's a place for sales reps, and it shouldn't be, but there is. So this is an area where we really got to get better.
And direct-to-consumer advertising, I think there are all sorts of ways information is shared, not necessarily through the most unbiased and educated clinicians, leaders, care providers. So then what should the solution be if you have bias all around?
Now we get totally into opinion that is well outside the remit of the FDA. So, I think there are two principles that I have, at least as I think about it. One is there's a balance of conflicts that we exist, and the idea the world's divided into good guys and bad guys doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But fundamentally, I think if things were centered around the well-being of the patients that we're supposed to be serving, a lot of things would look different in the way we do things. I'm going to leave it at that because, I mean, I'm raising issues that are not fundamental to the function of the FDA, but they do affect things like post-market safety and things that we see that do need attention.
Okay. So we have a few minutes left. I did want to touch upon a particular disease category just because it's become very popular, the topic of obesity. So given what seems to be increasing popularity and use of a particular class of drugs, the GLP-1s, which originally were approved to treat diabetes, and through clinical research we found that it does also induce weight loss and can have positive health benefits. You know, how can the agency help make sure that the right people are using these drugs, meaning, for example, people who have health reasons to need to lose weight are using GLPs as opposed to folks who might have, you know, more of a near-term cosmetic desire to lose some weight?
Well, here we get into the practice of medicine, and it's not fundamentally our job to make sure the right people get the treatment. It is our job to deal with what happens if people where the risks are elevated get a treatment. But here you're talking about a class of drugs that, at least so far, looks like it's very effective for the intended use, and physicians have every right in the United States to prescribe off-label. And so I would sort of throw this back to the health systems and the professional groups that need to pay attention to this. And of course, this is going to be a big issue for CMS because I always have to say, depending on data that's not in yet, if it looks as good for weight loss without diabetes, there's a very large proportion of the Medicare population, for example, would be eligible for treatment. At the current cost, that would be a huge effect on the Medicare budget. But we don't want to be in a situation where only wealthy, highly educated people have access to a treatment. And of course, right now we have shortages because wealthy, highly educated people are scarfing it up. But you know, the industry will respond by making more. I'm not so worried about, I mean, the shortages now are not good, but that'll get solved. I think the bigger question is how do we work across professional groups and health systems and payers to optimize who gets the treatment and answer all the questions that will follow up, like for how long, and what will the ultimate cost effectiveness be. But you know, you said FDA, it's not in our remit.
So I want to end where we began as we think about you know, the last 3 years, COVID, the public health emergency that recently was declared over. By the declaration of the public health emergency, the secretary, your office, had special authorities. Those authorities allowed us to develop therapies in record time through emergency use authorization. What have we learned from that that we can apply to future drug development, given that we have patients suffering from so many different diseases that at the bedside we want to treat and we want to try new things? Are there things that we can do, that your office can do, that can help us make better policy in this space?
Well, to me, the number one thing we learned, which is not a new lesson, is when we're fully aligned across clinical practice, health systems, the medical products industry, and the regulators, and the payers, it's amazing what can be done in America. We're just in a talented country where miraculous things really can happen. I think some people get lost because when they think about this, because there were also a lot of shortcuts. There were a lot of risks that were taken along the way because it was an emergency. And we had to make our best guess about a lot of things for things like EUAs. And we already have a system that says for things like accelerated approval, when there's a real need, then we're willing as a society to take more risks, but not for things where you're adding a new treatment in an area where there already are effective treatments. for example. And one of the biggest things we don't talk about enough is federal government put in a lot of money. Now, I wasn't at the FDA. I was at Alphabet during the time of the beginning of the pandemic. But you know, people talk about the mRNA vaccines. They forget that there were multiple vaccines that were funded. Only a couple of them made it. So a lot of what's attributed to, well, the FDA could do things faster was really a byproduct of multiple shots on goal, a lot of federal investment, de-risking things for companies that I'm not sure we would all say would be a good public policy in peacetime. And so there's a balance. You know, I always got to throw in the use of virtual technologies as a standard. That's something that we're often running, and we're going to use it, you know, as much as we can. It'll speed things up. In theory, it will give people more access, although I always have to throw in there, high technology also goes to the wealthy and highly educated first in our society. So we're going to have intentionality about making the virtual possibilities available in rural areas and people with less means. So a lot was learned, but I'm afraid some people think that there were lessons learned that are not quite right.
Well, our time is up. I would like to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you, Tazeen, for a wonderful discussion.